Start the recording. All right. Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the third meeting of the Housing Capacity and Urbanization Technical Advisory Committee. And just a quick note of thanks for everyone's great participation in our previous meeting. I personally found it really helpful to hear from everyone, get to know you all and your perspectives just a little bit better. There's going to be plenty of time for more of that, but yeah, thanks for a good first, or meeting number 2, technically. We are not going to go through introductions today, but we have several people in one of the Zoom rooms, DLCD staff. So why don't the 3 of you go ahead and introduce yourselves so people know who's in that room?
All right, maybe I'll start to my left over here.
Hi, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Mari Valencia Aguilar. I'm a housing planner with the department.
And Mari will be taking notes for us today, so we'll have a summary of our meeting as usual. Karen Guillen Chapman, good afternoon. Welcome, everybody. I serve as a UGB specialist here at DLCD, and I'm also joined by one more colleague.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Kevin Young. I'm a senior urban planner with the agency. I'm mostly here to watch and hear the conversation, but I've been handling UGB decisions for the agency for a while, so I'll be interested to hear the conversation.
All right, thank you all, and thanks to everyone for taking time to be with us again today. Jenna, should we go ahead and start the PowerPoint, please? Okay, let's go to the next slide. So I will review our agenda. So in just a minute, I'm going to talk a little bit more about our upcoming meetings through June. But today, our objective is, well, I'll say after that, I'm going to hand it over to Karin to talk about the racial equity framework focus areas. And then our main objective for today's meeting is to discuss how rules and guidance can facilitate best practices related to constraints. Our agenda includes some brief presentations to help us think about the challenges of balancing housing needs and feasibility with the protection of resources, life, and property. And we're going to approach this conversation today in 2 chunks. First, by discussing constraints with less ambiguity in rules and statutes, and namely 100-year floodplains and slopes and landslides. And then the second piece will be looking at optional constraints in rules and statutes, things like wetlands and riparian buffers and other hazards such as tsunamis and wildfires. Next, and then at the end of the meeting, we'll do a little recap of what we heard and talk about our next steps. Next slide, please. So just a quick overview of our next 3 meetings, with a little bit of a 3-meeting arc to talk about buildable land inventories. Again, today our focus is on accounting for constraints. Next month, we're going to look at estimating capacity. And then in June, we're going to talk about inventorying development-ready lands. So that can help you kind of get your mindset of this 3-meeting arc where we're focused on buildable land inventories. Before I hand it over to Karin, one process note for today. Just a reminder that process suggestions and ground rules are found on page 4 of the Charter and Operating Principles. Keep in mind that our goal is to hear from a balance of people and perspectives. And just as a notice to that end, I might not always be calling on people in the order that you raise your hands in order to kind of get that balance. And sometimes I might be calling on people who we haven't heard from as much. So just keep that in mind. Just because you've raised your hand and you're next up in the queue, we might kind of hold off on calling on you until later, until we have heard from some other folks. Our time, as you know, is very limited, and we really want to make the most of it. So with that, I'll hand it over to Karin.
All right, I'll do that next slide. So we have this linked for you in your meeting materials, and we've seen this racial equity framework in each of our TAC meetings as well as our Rules Advisory Committee meeting. We touched, last time we met in March, we touched on historical inequities and benefits and burdens, and talked through, we shared a couple questions in that series under these categories. So today I wanted to touch on a couple new questions. If we can go to that next slide. So last time under historical inequities, we looked at what is under the jurisdiction of the Oregon land use system and introduced some concepts there. And today we're focusing on the benefits and burdens of thinking about these rules for capacity analysis work and urbanization, specifically around what are the benefits and burdens that we're dealing with that have financial, environmental, social impacts, and how does that play out in our different communities. With communities of color, disadvantaged communities, or underrepresented communities. Also thinking about what are some of the unintended consequences of the rules that we're working with, and how might we mitigate if we find some of these consequences later down the road. So as we think about the work we're doing, we're thinking about the location of our housing, what we can do with infill, what we're doing in greenfield areas, when we think about equitable ways for prioritizing and financing infrastructure, and thinking about the displacement risks that all of this work has, and what does that mean for communities that historically have been highly impacted by these practices and these governmental actions at the local level. I want to briefly touch on what we heard last time. So I will go to that next slide. Thanks, Jenna. So we talked a lot about the BLI methodology and capacity analysis in general, what felt really ambiguous for practitioners and interested parties and advocate groups, really thinking about how do we quantify these constraints? What does it look like to evaluate partially vacant lands and estimating capacity there? What can be provided with public facilities? What does that mean when we say we cannot provide public facilities in certain parcels or certain areas? And then what does it mean to be severely constrained by hazards? So you'll notice we'll touch on a couple of these today. And then as Steve mentioned, the rest of these we will cover over a series of 3 discussions. So in May, we'll look at capacity and estimating capacity and forecasting redevelopment. And then in June, we'll look at development readiness and infrastructure and facilities. All right, I'm trying to remember what that next slide is. Let's have a look here. So our statute, which is also linked in your packet, here's where we have our definition. The statute, or I'm sorry, the rules, excuse me, under Division 8 have a definition for us, as well as some specific constraints that give jurisdictions a safe harbor to discount these or to inventory as not buildable, and then how the buildable lands inventory is carried out in the analysis work. But as well, there's also some general language, and so we'll talk about the language in the rules and what is specified, what is not, and some other rules that really govern these resources. And so getting into that, we'll start with the hazards area. So what does it mean to be severely constrained by hazards? What does that look like when we're thinking about the floodplain and how a jurisdiction addresses those in their local community? And we have with us a specialist today. So Deanna Wright is our National Floodplains Insurance Program Coordinator. So I want to invite her into this space, and we'll move into that next slide. Deanna, do you want to test out your audio visual with us?
Sure. Hi, everybody. I'm Deanna Wright. I'm Oregon's National Flood Insurance Program Coordinator here at DLCD. Can everybody hear me okay? Oh, good. I've been at DLCD for about 1.5 years now, and in my role, I really provide technical guidance to communities across Oregon. We have over 260 NFIP communities in Oregon where we provide technical assistance to, where we're primarily, our wheelhouse is like floodplain management and helping them with permitting and floodplain questions just in general, so that they stay in good standing with their floodplain programs. And in Oregon, the floodplain programs are delegated to the local authorities, so city or counties or tribes, to implement their own programs at the local level. So when we're talking about floodplain, I thought it was prudent to bring up some images here to begin to talk to you about what the floodplain looks like on a cross section and then what it looks like on a floodplain map. So in this image here, what you're seeing is the upper image here. It has some terminology that I wanted to go over. And from left to right, you'll see that the left bank and the right bank have this flood fringe edge boundary for the floodplain. And in the middle, you have a floodway boundary, and then the base flood elevation. Those are the three kind of areas of a cross section where I wanted to daylight. There's different regulations in each of those areas. And that's where local floodplain permits are required, as well as the mandatory purchase of flood insurance for federally backed mortgages. And then the bottom image here, I wanted to daylight the image of what a floodway looks like, because in the floodway, that's the most volatile area in a floodplain. That's where you're going to see more velocity and greatest depths. It's also where the floodplain regulations really strive to keep development out of that flood area. This bottom image here might be something that you can potentially envision. It's Highway 101, and it's right where you're going north into out of Tillamook City there. So it's kind of like a expansive floodway there, just to give you an idea of that area. And then again, regulations are a little bit more stringent in this area, and it requires a no rise in flood heights. So folks that are wanting to develop in that area, they have an additional requirement to do no harm or to do no rise in that area. And it's an engineering analysis that they're going to be hiring to get to that result of a no rise. Can we go to the next slide, please? Okay, so when I was thinking it from a floodplain management perspective, what I wanted to lay out was kind of my experience in this role and maybe some considerations where development limitations are being done and maybe some additional recommendations that I could give. I don't review BLIs or buildable lands inventories in my role, but I have had experience at a couple times where we had some correspondence between planners on what they were supposed to subtract or clip out of their inventory. And it was my understanding and my experience that some communities were counting the floodplains and floodways, and some were extracting it or subtracting it from their BLIs. So from a floodplain manager's perspective, I thought about it at 3 levels. One could consider potentially subtracting the floodway boundary from the BLI. It's something that is mapped throughout Oregon. The floodways are mapped in all areas where there's studied floodplain. That's the most volatile area as I see it. That's where you'll see the most damage and most velocity again. Another consideration to give is subtracting the 10% chance flood area from a buildable lands inventory. And the 10% flood area has a chance of being equaled or exceeded in any given year as a definition. I'll note that though at current, no community in Oregon has the 10% inundation layer mapped, but they would need to model it in a 10% profile. So for example, if we're dealing with a tributary that's mapped A zone or approximate, there's not going to be a 10% profile. It's just going to be in their model. It's not going to be something that's mapped, or it's not something spatial. So it's not something that they can get their GIS team to clip out, for example. But it's not, I wanted to chat about it. It's not something that's not attainable. It's just, it would take an engineering staff person to do that 10% inundation layer throughout those communities where this could be applicable to. So it's not something that's not attainable. It would just take additional engineering efforts to map that 10% inundation layer. And that's like the layer that's right above bank full. It's where you could see the benefit of health and safety being considered, and where natural and beneficial functions take place in that 10% layer as well. Another consideration could be subtracting a larger portion of the floodplain from the BLI. So it could be all the way from left bank to right bank in that map that we previously were showing you. It could be the whole 100-year floodplain as a whole being clipped from that buildable lands inventory. So where's this being done? Some examples I can give is, for example, in Washington State, they enacted prohibition for new residential development in all of their regulatory floodways across the whole state. So they have it by rule as a support since the 1969 flood event. 1969 flood event is known as the 100-year, the 1% chance flood, widespread in the Pacific Northwest. And that prohibition was upheld in case law in 1978. Another area where limited development is occurring is through those communities that participate in the community rating system. And in Oregon, 24 NFIP communities participate in the CRS system and program. And one of the activities there is open space. Open space is an area where the community has agreed that's off limits to development or very low development potential. So like in your parks and rec zoning, or dunes or coastal zoning, where development doesn't really happen within the special flood hazard area or the floodplain areas. And that's working for some communities where those higher regulatory activities take place. Another recommendation I can give based off my experience in this role is to strengthen or add clarity to the Division 8 text for when it deals with floodplains, such as land considered suitable and available unless it is within the designated floodway or a larger flood hazard area, such as like the 10% area or the whole floodplain area in and of itself. So that's kind of what I wanted to cover, and I'm here for questions. I tried to simplify something that's kind of technical in nature, but I'm definitely here for questions if they arise.
Yeah, Steve, I was going to see if I could interject just for a second. That's okay. I got the thumbs up. I wanted to, before we move into questions, I think we're going to group these questions. When we think about the hazards and floodways and floodplains, and then when we think about other hazards, there's the way the rule is written, there's a little bit of discretion there, what happens locally. We heard that from Beth last week. While the majority of cities are not counting the floodway, the 100-year, the 100-year floodplain is not inventoried as buildable in most land inventories. There is a way for jurisdictions to take the safe harbor or to look locally the conditions that they have in their community and what they might do with it. So I've invited Derek to come and share with us when we think about slopes is an interesting one too. Slopes and landslide hazards, how there is the safe harbor and rules, but then what does that look like on the local level and how might it deviate a little bit? So we'll jump into Derek and then I'm going to hand it back to you, Steve. Thanks for letting me interject.
Perfect.
Yeah, good afternoon. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Fantastic. Derek Tokos, Community Development Director for the City of Newport. And with respect to constrained lands, I've had the opportunity to work with Newport twice now on updating the city's buildable lands inventory and various housing studies and policies. And I think that the flexibility that's built into the administrative rule, I think, is very important, recognizing that different municipalities face different issues. And some constraints are more severe than others, depending on where you're located. In Newport, for example, slopes, were we to go with slopes in excess of 25%, we literally wouldn't have any buildable land. Our terrain is such that there's very little flat ground. Almost everything we have is sloped, or where we do have flat ground, it's often impacted by wetlands and things of that nature, floodplain areas. And so, from our purposes, we recognize that we can accommodate a meaningful amount of housing and certain housing types on slopes in excess of 25%. So we chose to go to 40. That's what is reflected on our maps. And in those steeper sloped areas, we recognize that you're probably looking at single family, detached, hillside type development. Sometimes, so you're looking at larger lots because there are portions of those properties that are even steeper and would be extremely difficult to develop. You can get some middle housing in that area. Generally, we don't expect to see much in the way of multifamily in the very steep slopes, just given the larger size of those structures and some of the issues that go along with that. Other significant factors for us, I mean, on the floodplain side, for example, we do consider those constraints. Our floodplain issue is a little bit different because we're on the coast. We have wave inundation, velocity zones, which is a little bit different issue than inland communities deal with. But again, you're talking a much more expensive construction. But in those cases, you're dealing with oceanfront properties, and often you're dealing with property owners who can afford to do that. But we don't expect to get a whole lot of additional housing units in floodplain areas because of those cost considerations. Also, we need to keep in mind, particularly along the bay, that's in our shoreland area where we have water dependent uses that need access to that bay. We don't want housing down there competing for that limited frontage along Yaquina Bay. So those are some of the factors that we considered with the floodplain side of things, and ensuring that those are constrained lands in our inventory. With respect to the shoreland area, we don't seek to protect all of our shoreland area. There's a fair amount of our shoreland area that is available for housing, but those areas that are natural resource protection areas within the shoreland boundaries is something that we focus on. With respect to geologic hazards, like many coastal communities, that's an issue that we struggle with. We face bluff erosion on the north side of our town. And then in the south part of our town, we have dune instability that we deal with. And we also have areas of kind of spot specific landslide susceptibility based on historic landslides that have happened in those areas. We have a lot of that overlooking our bayfront, for example, where we've got some unstable slopes there, a lot of springs, instability. We don't view geologic hazards as a constraint to the extent that we're not going to see housing there. It is part of our constrained lands, but we do see a fair amount of housing, again, just because a lot of what we have that's geologically unstable also happens to be oceanfront property that's very desirable. We had the option of including our tsunami inundation area, which really impacts South Beach. You see it on the map in yellow here. As many of you know, when Dogami reworked the tsunami inundation maps, the XXL t-shirt size, approach that they took picked up a lot more land than the previous inundation red line had encumbered. We have a fair amount of residential zone land in that area. We've elected to not seek to rezone that to non-residential use. So we will still see some additional infill in those areas. But what we did do is take the step to restrict sensitive populations that would have a difficult time evacuating the area should we have a nearshore cascading event. So nursing homes, for example, assisted living facilities, large child care facilities, where you have populations that would just have a very difficult time evacuating. Those are not permitted in those areas, but just your typical residential housing is. And we do try to mitigate that, through to a point, we've built in South Beach, the city, with some federal assistance, built a tsunami evacuation assembly area called Safe Haven Hill. We've worked with Oregon State University. They built vertical evacuation into their Marine Science Initiative building, or MSI building, at the Hatfield campus. We're burying overhead utility lines in that area to remove that as a potential evacuation hazard. So we're taking and have taken a number of steps, improved pathways for evacuations, wayfinding that both educates folks and directs them to places where they would be, outside of immediate harm if we have that nearshore event. So that's just kind of, again, that's just touching on kind of our approach. I guess the last piece I would touch on has to do with cannot be provided with public facilities, which is another component here on looking at constrained lands. And while I don't want to do a deep dive on it right now, this last buildable lands inventory that we did, we took the additional step of doing a constructability assessment, where we took a hard look at residential lands that have been effectively idle within our urban growth boundary for a very long time, some of which since our urban growth boundary was originally acknowledged in the early 80s, and to assess what it would take to get infrastructure to those properties to meet a range of different housing types. And that work, showed that, in some cases, in some areas, it's feasible. In other areas, it's not. And, I think that was very informative for our policymakers and others to get a better understanding of what it really takes to bring land online for housing development.
Great. Thank you very much, Derek, for sharing the Newport experience. Oh, do you have some more to go through?
No, I think, I only provided a few slides for this discussion, and, just really come visual cues. This last one here just shows we didn't really have the capacity to evaluate all residential vacant and partially vacant land within our urban growth boundary that was available for development. So what we did is we took 9 study areas or sub areas and took a hard look at those. These are areas where we had a little bit better handle on what the infrastructure needs would be based on our facility planning and other plans that have been prepared by developers who had made attempts at developing these properties but just couldn't pull it off. So we had a fair amount of information to kind of inform the analysis in these study areas. And as I said, I think the results were very informative.
Great. Thank you very much, Derek. Okay, so we have about 15 to 20 minutes for discussion. We have Deanna, who can answer some questions, but to frame our discussion, we also want to hear from you and your experience. And we have these 2 questions. First, how can the buildable land inventory best account for constrained areas that are unlikely to develop in the 20-year planning period? And second, how should a local government's comprehensive plan characterize mapped natural hazard areas within its urbanizable area? So please keep those 2 questions in mind. And I want to, Kasara, if you still have the same question you had before, we can start with you.
I do. Thank you. This one is for Deanna. And I was curious, I understand there's some changes with the state's NFIP program implementation coming based off I think it's the FEMA biological opinion. I was curious if the recommendations that you have around, characterizing buildable lands within the floodway or floodplain, if that's all related to this biological opinion.
Deanna, you're on mute.
You're on mute, yeah.
Sorry about that. The BIOP is something I'm gonna have to wrap my head around a little bit more, because they haven't published, FEMA has not published the new standards yet. So they haven't been published out in a draft environmental impact statement, nor have they been published in the new draft model code. So I'm not really sure how to measure whether or not there'll be overlap there, or what the exact new design standards are going to be for Oregon based off the biological opinion. Some of those standards are things like compensatory storage, of fill, setbacks, and stormwater drainage, because they're trying to do a no net loss standard based off the biological opinion conclusion. But I don't have a crystal ball to know what those standards are going to be yet. So it's still a little bit too early to know what those biological opinion standards are going to be.
Yeah, I was wondering, since this group has a little extra time to work through our rulemaking process, if there's a maybe stronger chance that opinion may come out, before or while we're in the midst of this work.
Yeah, it could happen. They're slotted to deliver their draft EIS, environmental impact statement, later this year to be published for another comment period. So it could be a timing thing, like you had mentioned.
Thanks, Deanna. So yeah, let's focus on this first question and thinking about the mappability of constraints and this first question about accounting for constrained areas that are unlikely to develop. I'm seeing Martha's raised hand. Go ahead, Martha.
So I got some sort of new update on my Zoom and I cannot figure out how to raise my hand. So I
Well, I
apologize.
saw you, so
Yes, I
we
know.
can work with that for now.
I suppose I need to figure it out. I have a couple of questions, and I guess I'm trying to wrap my head around what's the problem we're trying to fix. And so is there a problem with the way that the language is written for the BLI right now? And is that problem that it is a little squishy, that we're not sure how it's interpreted? And I think what I heard from Derek, I think, is that having flexibility in there is helpful, and I would be inclined to agree with that. I feel like different jurisdictions have different regulations around floodway, floodplain, and other mapped hazard areas. For example, Clackamas County doesn't allow new development in the floodway. We would take that out of a buildable land inventory, but we do allow development in the 100-year floodplain, going through a floodplain development permit. So I wouldn't see a need to take that out of the buildable land inventory. And so I feel like having flexibility in there is important, but I'm also trying to wrap my head around what we're trying to fix with this question is the first thing. And the second, because I always have multiple questions, right? I think I heard one of the recommendations might be to add in there specifically that you would remove the floodway or this 10% area as an example. And I would definitely be hesitant to add a regulation in there for an area like this 10% area that's not mapped, because that would create a whole sort of new set of analysis and work for a jurisdiction to do. If we're adding different regulations in there, I would definitely like it to be something that is already available or easily available for a jurisdiction. So.
Great, Martha. Thanks on that second point. And on the first, just to maybe help clarify the question, we're trying to answer and the guidance we're looking for, I'll hand it back to Karin and her colleagues in the Zoom room over there.
Yeah, that was perfect cue. So that is the question, to create a mutual understanding of, we heard in that slide where I shared what we heard from this group and what we've been hearing leading up to rulemaking is we need greater clarity and certainty. But an opportunity that we see and we're hearing from both Clackamas County, from Newport, from many communities around the state, is the ambiguity may be less ambiguous than it is flexibility provided to those jurisdictions. So where do we keep the ambiguity because it provides the opportunity to respond to local community conditions versus where do we need greater clarity and certainty and direction? And if it is something around, floodways shall not be inventoried in a buildable lands inventory, does that work or does that not work? Right now, all land is suitable and available as long as it is not severely constrained. Does that meet our needs? So that's exactly the question we're getting at. Do jurisdictions need some shalls? Do jurisdictions prefer that clarity and certainty? Or do jurisdictions prefer, and it works better, the status quo, the ambiguity is squishy, but it allows us to respond to our local conditions?
Thank you, Kevin. Let's go to Damien.
Thanks, Steve. Whoops, there we go. Can we go back to the slide that had the floodplain fringe and floodway boundary on it? Please? Because I think I was appreciating what Deanna was sharing about focusing on the floodway in the rules, and that could work if that's a GIS layer that's accessible to local governments where we can measure the amount of land within that floodplain that might not capture areas in the flood fringe. So I think one thing I would offer, and this might not be a question we need to answer now, but down the road looking at if the areas in the flood fringe are then available for development, then considering what types of housing we're going to get, because I think in our experience here, we're not going to see affordable housing types, middle housing types. This might be more single family detached homes, which might help meet some of that need, but might not meet other housing needs. So I wanted to offer that to help answer question 1.
Thanks, Damien. That's helpful consideration. Let's go to Mary Kyle, and then I'll loop back to you, Heather.
Thanks. I think this has been really useful hearing from Derek and Martha and the experts in the beginning. And so I wondered, like, who is the ambiguity question? Who is it ambiguous for? Is it local governments, or is it also developers, or both? And I wonder if some of it stems from, this is a question for local governments, if some of that ambiguity is due to the need for local governments to have funding and technical assistance to update the mapping of these various types of constrained lands. Because I think some of it probably were done when they originally adopted their plans and haven't really been updated, and a lot has changed. So and that's not getting into administrative rules, but if that is something that's needed, it seems to me it should be something that we should capture. But that's a question for local governments. Some of that ambiguity just due because there's a need to update these maps.
Great, thanks. Consideration for local governments to answer. Heather, go ahead.
Hi, thank you. So I'm with the City of Eugene, and I just wanted to echo that I think we do appreciate the flexibility in this part of the OARs regarding natural resources. And I think that the discussion earlier about Newport was really interesting to hear the differences about, for instance, slope as an example. I know that's not what we're on right now, but where you might use different thresholds. I think, again, that flexibility is really important because it's just going to be different in different cities. I think it would be helpful if there was a guidance included about whether or not a jurisdiction, or just clarity about whether or not a jurisdiction can exclude certain natural hazards if their land use code allows for development within those areas, rather than how it is right now, simply stating that those lands are not considered suitable and available, generally not considered suitable and available. So it's not really making it more strict, but it's just providing that extra clarity, which it sounds like a lot of jurisdictions, including Eugene, our floodplain ordinance, we consider floodways in our buildable lands inventory unbuildable. They're considered protected. Our floodplain, though, our floodplain ordinance does allow for development with mitigation, like a lot of jurisdictions do. And so we kind of draw a bright line there with our buildable lands inventory, because we do allow development with mitigation. And so, for the purposes of, I think, legalities, because you can demonstrate that it is buildable with mitigation, we don't feel comfortable taking it off. but it would be nice if the OARs were a little bit more clear that that is allowable to assume those areas are buildable if your land use code allows development in them.
Thank you, Heather. Let's go to Brock.
First I'll just add a +1 to all the local flexibility comments, but two, I wonder, and this is maybe more of a technical question, so I don't know if Kevin or Karen have an exact answer to this, but so if you have an area that you say is, and let's do this from just the infrastructure standpoint, right? Whether it can be serviced within 20 years. If you have an area that you don't think is going to be able to be serviced within 20 years, and you say, okay, that is not buildable land within our UGB, would it be possible to develop kind of like an exemption process and say like, hey, we've actually figured something out here that we can do. We don't want to go through a full BLI update, but we now realize that these lands that we thought maybe weren't going to develop in 20 years, we found a way to do that. And now we can apply for like a waiver process to build in that area. Or is that something that would be prohibited by other portions of rule or statute?
I'm going to answer the first half of it, and then I'm going to listen to Kevin. Yeah.
Okay, go ahead.
So I'll start us off, and then I'll pass it over to Kevin. I mean, my understanding is land that is within your UGB that you are inventorying as buildable. The bar is pretty high for determining a jurisdiction cannot serve it because it has gone through all of the analysis to bring it into the UGB. Granted, there are certainly parcels of land that you would not include in that buildable lands inventory. But should you accidentally meet that very high bar that these are not serviceable, and then later on down the road within your planning period, you want to show that they are, I'm not sure that that would gain the jurisdiction. I don't know what that would gain for that local community. Kevin, what have you seen in the past?
I guess, well, I'm not quite sure, Brock. You're asking about a waiver. What are we waiving? What's the
So for example, if you had a portion of land that you decided was not buildable, but then found a way to do it,
okay.
would you not be able to build on it because it's not classified as buildable land?
Oh, I see what you're saying. If it's in your UGB and you find a way to serve it and there are no protections, no, resource or hazard protections, I don't see why you couldn't build it. If it's currently in your UGB, I think a local government could amend their findings based on serviceability. But I don't think you'd need a waiver from anything. You should be authorized to do that. Maddie, you just came on camera. Did you have a?
Yeah.
Go ahead.
Thank you, Kevin, and thanks, Brock, for the question. I think this raises a very important separation between what a buildable land inventory does and what it doesn't do. Buildable land inventories do not prevent land from being developed. It is, however, a tool that cities use to determine what land they can count on as capacity to satiate a housing need. And that's something more involved that we'll get into in subsequent conversations with this group. But what's critical to know is that not all land that's inventoried will be built in the planning period, and not all land that's inventoried as unbuildable will truly not develop. For example, I think we heard from Deanna that there are ways to develop property in the floodplain. They just might be beyond, let's say, a standard deviation from a norm. They might have a lot more challenge or a lot more financial requirements in order to develop, or they may develop at a lower density than what other land zoned of a similar zoning designation might achieve.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. I think we'll go to the DLCD Zoom room and then get back to you, Sam, and then it'll be about time to move on to our next topic.
Yeah.
Assuming, Heather, that you already your hand is up from before. Sorry, Karen.
I am not speaking on behalf of DLCD, but Al Johnson wanted to be here today and he couldn't, but he submitted some comments. And so I will just very briefly let you know that it is available in public comments, and I will give you the link to that, because if Al had been able to be here, I think this is what he would have shared with the group. He cautions the group to not conflate the identification of buildable lands with the expected yield of those lands for housing or residential use. He does this more eloquently and much more elaborately in his full comment. So I'm going to link that in the chat. And then, Steve, I know we're going to take a couple more hands, and then we're going to have Amanda present on our natural resources, specifically our wetlands. But Derek was invited back to share a little bit about Newport. And Derek, we might skip over you. Let's see how time provides, because I think you got the gist of it, Derek. But if there's anything you want to add, let me know. So depending on time, Steve, we might modify slightly our order.
Okay. Okay, so we'll hear from Sam, and then we'll go to Amanda, and then we'll see where we're at for time. Sam, go ahead.
Yeah, I think not a lot of new to add here, other than I think I'm probably pretty consistent with Al's comments there about sort of what should be considered capacity versus buildable as far as constraints go. In Portland, we're using the floodway, and then the floodplain's only really being considered once we start to look at the capacity of the lands of which we identify as buildable. So we'll greatly reduce the capacity depending on the land use, the perceived land use that might go onto those lands if it's in a floodplain, but we're still going to consider them part of that sort of baseline buildable land inventory. I mean, we also have protection zones, environmental protection zones, that really are, and it's an overlay zone that looks specifically at high value natural resources. And we have conservation zones too, but the protection zones and the floodway is the only thing that we're extracting completely from our buildable land inventory. And we've based that on development trends over the last business cycle, which for all intents and purposes is 20 years. So I think as far as like rulemaking and what should be in the dictated there by the state is really probably minimal from our perspective, and maintaining that flexibility is good, so we have the ability to then sort of bring things forward that relate to sort of capacity rather than the buildable land itself.
Thanks, Sam. Let's go to you, Corey, before we go to Amanda then.
Great, thanks. I just wanted to chime in with a few thoughts. So I thought Damien's comments about the floodway, I appreciated those. And I think given some of the information that was shared in this meeting, having that as a baseline for the floodway piece so that there is some consistency for folks seems like a place for me that I think makes sense. And I know there's always this tension of sort of striking this balance between additional clarity and then flexibility for cities. But I think for the floodway piece, like that one might make sense. And then I just wanted to elevate for in Derek's presentation, like the constructability assessment. So kind of taking the public facilities planning and sort of taking that to sort of a further degree of refinement. I do think that that is something that I'm interested in hearing and understanding more about, because I do think that that is something that really helps us understand what's needed to get all of these lands, to get the ones that are the higher priorities, like what's really needed to get them developing and turning into housing, right? And I think like that is at the core of good planning, is that we want things that are actually going to come forward in reality. And so I think like that when we think about tools that might help us get there, that part of his presentation I thought was particularly interesting. So I just wanted to share those thoughts.
Thank you, Corey. And maybe when we loop back, if we have time for Derek to touch on that, that would be helpful. But now let's shift to our next conversation about these other or optional constraints and rules and statutes. And Amanda's going to lead us through a brief presentation.
Hello, everyone. So I'm Amanda Punton. I'm the Natural Resource Specialist at DLCD. There was a period of time, 2.5, 3 years, that I worked on National Flood Insurance Program stuff, particularly when the FIAP was first initiated. So I can't refrain from making some connections to that, but I will keep them small. But I will just start off by saying that we sometimes talk about things like hazard areas and natural resources if they're different things, but particularly when we're talking about rivers and floodplains, that is where fish live, where wildlife lives, and they can be one and the same, and where the water exists and where the floods exist on the landscape is really important for understanding how to provide what we need for our aquatic and some of our terrestrial species. So I'm here to talk about how, I guess mostly how we currently work with natural resource protection under Goal 5. And I've highlighted riparian areas, wetlands, and wildlife habitat, because I think those are kind of the biggest ones for this conversation. And those are the 3 Goal 5 resource categories that require local inventories in order to move to the next step of identifying what's significant and what areas should be protected. So so I have here a section out of our Division 23, which is our Goal 5 rules, where it was specifically recognized that any lands that are protected under Goal 5 are, if the protection means limiting or prohibiting development in those areas, then of course they should not count towards a buildable land inventory. And that's written directly into our rule, but it's also reflected into the urbanization rules that we saw before. So I think that's all I need to say here.
All right, next, Rico.
So let me say a little bit more. So riparian areas, the Goal 5 rule has a safe harbor for identifying what is the significant riparian area. And there's a safe harbor for what protection measures should be, which basically excludes development, allows roads and utilities to traverse the protected riparian area. And that's important because that's a relatively technically it's very easy for a local government to move through the Goal 5 process for riparian areas. Not that the safe harbor protection areas are ecologically sound, but that's what we have in our rule. And but when we look at wetlands and wildlife habitat, it's more complicated than that. And so today I'm just going to be talking about the wetland piece. So we know that without local protection, that we have federal and state laws that require no net loss of wetlands, because so many wetlands have been lost over the years. And they're really important for a variety of function, but for the folks in the room here, I'll just mention groundwater recharge, flood attenuation, and also helping with keeping water flowing in the streams, which is a good thing. Also, I guess that's it. Yeah. Stormwater, but through that, through the flood attenuation is kind of a similar function there. So, even without local Goal 5 wetland protections, there's barriers to developing in floodplains, as we know. Even if it's available to just write a check and have mitigation dealt with by somebody else, by DSL or somebody else later on, there's not always wetland credits in order to be able to do that. And if you're going to have to try to mitigate for your impacts on wetlands, and even the application, right? It's difficult. So we recognize that even where we don't have local protections, wetlands pose a barrier to development. So can you go to the next slide? Because so I'm going to say that for local jurisdictions, and we're mostly here, we're talking about cities over 10,000, right? So many of our cities, I believe, over 10,000 have already done their Goal 5 protection for riparian areas and wetlands. So that's good. And once that's done, then what are left are the wetlands that were not identified as locally significant wetlands. So those are wetlands that did not, with a functional assessment, did not show that they were high functioning for like 4 different categories of wetland functions. And those are functions that are, again, important to the city. So the idea is that if they're significant wetlands, let's keep those functions where they are, because that's good for the city to have them where they are. And then the ones that are low functioning, then leave that to the feds and the state DSL for permitting, as those laws have existed for a long time. So DSL or DLCD doesn't have any rules or policies right now that allow a city to identify natural resource areas as constrained lands if in a buildable lands inventory, if the city has not amended its comprehensive plan and codes to be consistent with Division 23. However, if a city has done that, then we know we've got our riparian areas kind of covered, right? You know, so we know what the limitations are in development there. Those protected riparian areas can be counted as 100% not buildable. For the wetlands, if there aren't like really good reasons to allow development in locally significant wetlands, then local codes will also very much constrain or restrict or prohibit development within those locally protected wetlands. So not counted in the buildable lands inventory. But we have, for the last, like 3 or 4 years, I guess, been talking about fitting in within the concept of, you know, we can consider these lands constrained, right? But the word generally there gives us some wiggle room, and recognizing that non-locally protected, or let me say non-significant wetlands, because this is after we've gone through the local Goal 5 process, we're left with some locally significant wetlands. And we think that there is, it's practical, and there's room within the current rule language to allow a city to discount the buildability of those non-significant wetlands if the city can look back over a period of time, I don't know if it's 20 years or whatever, and say, hey, you know, we've had these on the books on our buildable lands inventory for a long time. They haven't been developed, or, you know, we can look and we can say, well, maybe only like 10% has been developed, or maybe 50% has been developed. And so based on that, the data and the history, a city could propose some percent discount for those non-locally protected wetlands. And I think those are the issues that I just wanted to cover today.
Great. So I guess I'll say, I know, you know, we're limited in time for discussion. I want to ask Derek, based on what, you know, we heard from Corey or what we heard from Amanda, if there's anything else you'd like to add to your Newport experience that might be helpful for the conversation.
With respect to floodplains, I think I touched on really what I wanted to touch on. I guess one additional issue to caution with respect to floodplains on a practical perspective, and a reason why we don't expect a whole lot of housing development in there, is you do have to consider the flood insurance component of that, and the volatility of flood insurance, and the difficulty of people obtaining flood insurance for their homes. I know it's not a straight up BLI type consideration, but when we go through these exercises for buildable lands at the local level, just from our perspective, it's about helping our policymakers chart a path forward with what makes sense. So with respect to administrative rules and guidance, you know, we don't do a deep dive on that. We don't dwell on that. We use it to kind of set the parameters of the discussion. And so that's probably why you're seeing me just kind of throwing in some things that maybe aren't technically administrative rule factors, but, you know, floodplain areas, you know, they're a challenge. I mean, this wetlands, serve a significant flood storage capacity for us. And we're very careful when it comes to development in and around wetlands and floodplain areas because of those cost considerations, the potential of property damage during severe floods, the impact of human lives as part of that, especially with folks who have a hard time, getting that kind of insurance. So that's all I would add.
Thanks, Derek. And I appreciate everyone helping us. I think we're getting to the heart of the question of, what should be in rules to give us clarity, but where is that flexibility needed? And I think that's what we're getting to. Beth Goodman, did you have anything to add to the conversation?
Very briefly, I will say that if we want to propose a way for cities to discount those non-significant wetlands, that we just make sure that in the guidance there's clear guidance about it, because it's really hard to figure out what would be sufficient information to do that without causing a city a lot of extra work.
Thanks, Beth. So other perspectives or experiences on kind of where that clarity from the rules is really helpful and necessary, and areas where guidance and flexibility is more helpful and productive. Let's go to Heather and then Derek.
I'll just echo really quickly what Beth said, some guidance around that, and the discussion earlier about being able to discount. We have some areas in Eugene that are larger kind of lake or smaller lake wetland areas that there's housing developed around it, but they didn't come up as significant in our Goal 5 inventory or for Goal 6 either. And so it's on our inventory for buildable, but there's housing around it, and so it's probably not going to develop. So some guidance around that would be helpful.
Great, thanks, Heather. Derek?
Yeah, I just want to put on the record, and I don't know it's necessarily a topic for this discussion, but that last piece in the rule, which gets it cannot be provided with public facilities, I do think that needs some further clarity and exploration. And I say that because while I recognize that some of the more modern urban growth boundary amendments, and we did a large one in 2006, where it was a swap there, and there was extensive analysis in terms of serviceability. But when you go back to a lot of the other acreage that's inside our UGB from initial acknowledgement in 82, or even periodic review in 91, or even some of the smaller UGB amendments, you don't have that level of analysis and detail. And a number of those properties, and that's one of the things that popped up with our constructability analysis is there are some of those properties that you're 20 million plus just to get infrastructure to the property. So what does it really mean for it? Not, that you cannot provide it with public facilities, particularly in the context right now. I mean, your construction costs have changed, your regulatory environment's changed, your expectations of what those public improvements should be have changed over the years. You didn't start back in the 1980s with a multimodal view of transportation. That's evolved quite a bit since then. And so I think there is room for work on that front.
Thanks, Derek. Before we go back to Heather, I just wanted to check in, Cotton and our DLCD team, if we're getting the guidance and insights from our TAC here that are going to be helpful in taking the next steps as we move through this process.
Yeah, I think so. And I want to reiterate something that Steve shared with us. That arc of conversations from April, May, and June is specifically around how these are interrelated. So cannot be serviced by public facilities or infrastructure, redevelopment capacity or buildability of partially vacant lands. We're going to get to all of this as we progress through May and into June, really looking at, there's a new requirement under ONA to inventory those development ready lands. And what does that mean? And I think in the meantime, we'll look at other jurisdictions and examples to bring in, but Derek, Newport has some really interesting information you could share with us in May and June as we progress, and we'll look for other jurisdictions as well. But I wanted to reiterate the arc that we're in and where we're going to get into each of those.
Thanks, Kevin. Heather.
And I meant to mention about the wetlands as well. One of the things that we've heard a bit about, and I don't know if this is unique to Eugene, but a lot of our wetlands are located in an area that was planned for industrial or large employment. So they're pretty large properties with pretty large wetlands on them. And we have an adopted wetlands preservation plan, the West Eugene Wetlands Plan for the area. And so that plan tried to strike a balance. And so there are some pretty notable wetlands that are identified as eligible for development. So they're not protected. But because of the cost of mitigation, we have examples of development building kind of around the edges, which is great. But it's building around the edges, but we're still counting that area as developable. And so how do we put some clarity in the rules around that, unless wetland mitigation costs are going to be changing sometime soon? That's been kind of a stickler in Eugene.
Thanks. Karen.
Yeah, I wanted to respond to that, Heather, and I think that gets at the issue that Amanda was raising, this idea of areas where development is allowed in wetlands nominally, but local governments aren't seeing development happening. Maybe the cost of mitigation is high or what have you. And so I think we're saying we're willing to consider that, but I heard Beth very clearly say, what is the analysis required there? And so I'll just spitball, if you will, and think about how difficult would it be for the city to go back, and maybe in those industrial lands, it might be a good example of, hey, these are lands that are zoned for the same use. They've been available for development for 5 or 10 years. We've seen X% of them develop, and if you were able to provide that information, it would give us a basis to discount the theoretical developability of some of those areas. You don't have to respond right now, but that's kind of what we're talking about, or one of the ideas we're talking about.
I'll just say that was why I was trying to give those examples, right? Is that we do have examples that we could put forward. And so if the guidance was clear that like, hey, if you have examples of where development has been developing around unprotected wetlands because of, whatever reason, then, I would hope that would be something we could put in the guidance that would help us get there. So I appreciate the concept for sure.
I'm curious if any of our other local jurisdictions have any thoughts or, to share from their experiences. Chelsea or Alyssa or Brandon, any thoughts from your perspectives and having potentially done some buildable lands inventory work in your communities and constraints that were particularly challenging as you went through that process? Go ahead, Alyssa.
I've been listening to the conversation and not feeling like I need to chime in because I feel like people are capturing the exact issues really well. And I feel like, being a coastal community, that a lot of what Derek is saying, I would just echo in terms of, almost anything is buildable if you have the right amount of money and the right amount of will at whatever regulatory level you have. And so to me, the question is sort of this interplay between what we've been talking about, which is just because it is buildable doesn't mean it will be built on in 20 years. And just because the land is buildable doesn't mean that the infrastructure is a feasible investment for a local government. And so I've been just listening because really I would have just agreed with pretty much everything that's been said. So thanks for asking.
Great. Chelsea or Brandon? Chelsea?
Yeah, hi. I would echo everything that's been said. I kind of was weighing like having the flexibility versus some certainty. For City of Coos Bay, it presents a problem in the sense of we have plenty of land constrained by slopes or natural hazard areas, but still enough by statute to be considered buildable, and therefore that restricts the city from being able to provide, sufficient evidence for a need to expand its UGB, right?
Right.
So I like the idea of having some guidance or some certainty around or direction around how you can vet out these areas that don't, that are maybe just lands that have sat vacant forever and aren't being developed, or the fact that the cost to develop those lands for other reasons besides slope or that they're in a hazard area makes it such that they're not going to be developed. Like having some, circumstances and direction on how you could vet out those areas as well, so that it would help a city support the need to bring in other lands that would be easier to develop.
Thanks, Chelsea. Anything to add, Brandon?
No, similar to the other two, I would just echo a lot of what's been shared from Umatillas' perspective. Particularly, I guess you could look at it as fortunate or unfortunate that just the way the federal process went through when they were putting in, the federal ownerships, the overwhelming majority of our floodplains and riparian areas and those types of things are on Army Corps land. So it's not something we're typically looking at from a developmental perspective. Certainly on the wetlands, we do get into some of those issues. And, speaking for a smaller jurisdiction, I would kind of maybe just share with the group, I think having some, clear guidance to let some of the smaller jurisdictions have some safe harbors or some things where if you don't have resources to go out and do, expensive studies or bring on consultants to do some of these more advanced mapping things, that's certainly a benefit from our perspective. But leaving the flexibility in there to where if you want to gear up and go after, some technical assistance or go out and hire a consultant to come in and do some of these higher level kind of analysis, I do like having the flexibility that way. But I probably don't have a lot to share on the floodplain and steep slopes. I'll certainly be more involved on some of the other buildable lands inventory because we're getting ready to kick off another effort ourselves.
No, those are helpful comments regardless, Brandon. Thank you. Go ahead, Corey.
Yeah, so it hasn't really come up in our conversation today, and I know the questions haven't really sort of framed this out, but when I was looking, at goal 7 and goal 5, something that I think that is really important to put in the room here is that better data and better information is going to lead to better inventories. And so something that I think local jurisdictions, at least my observation, is that when it comes to riparian wetland and wildlife habitat, and for the city of Bend, I mean, it's been many, many decades since we've done sort of a full goal 5 inventory update. And so I think we get better planning results. We get, less paper capacity, more real capacity, right? When we're working from the best information available. And so I guess I just wanted to flag, I think there's, something around the data piece. And I think when I look at the sources of information that cities are using to help inform these inventories, a lot of it is coming from the state. And so when we talk about streamlining and sort of what kind of things can be done to help, alleviate some of the analytical burden and those pieces, I do think that there's something there around that I think would be good to explore. And then I think the other is just it's more of a question for the jurisdictions and practitioners on this call. Something particularly around the wetlands issue I've heard is that cities need better data from DSL on delineation of wetlands, and that would really benefit a lot of jurisdictions in helping plan better around what those constrained lands look like. And so I'm curious, is that actually true? Is that something jurisdictions are actually experiencing? Would that be something that's helpful? So just a comment and then a question there for other folks who are on the call today. Thanks.
Thanks, Corey. I'm going to go to the DLCD Zoom room, and then Joy will loop back to you because I think maybe you raised your hand in response to some of Corey's comments.
Yeah, thank you. So Corey, the state wetland inventory, does a reasonably good job of indicating the presence of wetlands with pretty rough boundaries, and sometimes I guess the presence of wetlands is a little bit rough. A few years back, the predominantly hydric soil layer was added in order to better flag the possibility of a wetland that wasn't identified on the National Wetlands Inventory. So the state wetlands inventory starts with the National Wetlands Inventory, but then the way it's improved is with local wetland inventories, and those require people on the ground to some degree. I mean, some of it's done, remotely looking at maps and stuff, but then you do have to go on the ground to really get a better idea of where the edges of those wetlands are. And then that information gets fed into the state wetland inventory, but it's like a partnership in a way, right? So, but that is the, getting those local wetland inventories completed does take time and money. And that, I think, if we had an unlimited amount of money, we would funnel money into that, into getting those done.
Thanks, Amanda.
Funded mandates or resources.
Joy, go ahead.
Hi, everyone. Thanks. And thanks for these presentations and discussion. Yeah, I was kind of tracking to see when to provide some comments. So when Corey started talking about inventories, I was like, okay, good. This is what I wanted to raise. So I'm Joy Levitt with ODFW. I missed the last meeting, so just wanted to say hi to everyone as well. Yeah, so just to echo what Corey was saying about the inventories, I think I know a lot of these comprehensive plans have not been updated, likely since plan acknowledgement, like a lot of the inventories and the protective measures that address natural resources, as Amanda said, whether it's wildlife habitat or riparian. So in some cases, when buildable lands are being evaluated, there could be areas that maybe are no longer significant. And then on the other side, areas that are more significant that are not even identified as a resource within a local comprehensive plan. So, how to kind of continue those conversations about incorporating data. And I hear from the local jurisdictions how to make it easy and, kind of more streamlined, and definitely interested in exploring some of that with DLCD and with other folks. And then the other comment I just wanted to raise about thinking about natural hazards and natural resources together. I mean, there's so many, they really go like hand in hand, in a lot of ways. There's so many co-benefits, and Amanda emphasized this too in her presentation, but I don't know if it could be incorporated or should be incorporated. The second question, I don't know about a local government's comprehensive plan characterizing natural resources or natural hazards. And I think that, FEMA has a lot of guidance on natural climate solutions and how some of those can be considered. So even if an area is within the buildable land inventory, kind of how to think about those co-benefits of function, I think is still really something to consider in the conversation. So, whether it's riparian corridors that can assist with like the soil retention and movement for wildlife, which is really important, or, as someone mentioned earlier, the floodways for flood storage and off-channel habitat for salmonids. So just to kind of emphasize those comments, and hopefully we can continue some of those conversations. So thank you.
All right, let's go to Sam and then Derek, and then we'll move into our recap and next steps.
I just wanted to highlight something, not something to solve immediately, but when we're talking about some of these other constraints that aren't fully eliminating land from consideration, they're not all made equal, obviously, and so they're all going to discount sort of the developability of the land in different ways. But there is something to be said about overlapping constraints and multiple constraints being on one site. So even if it isn't a floodway, if it is floodplain, and then say, I don't know, brownfields or something else, and some other constraints that exist in a way that do make development very difficult, I think there is something to be said about treating those in the same way as sort of fully constraining a site similar to floodway. I know there's a sort of there's added complications with that, and it's sort of, we've dealt with it in a certain way, City of Portland, But yeah, it's just it's something to consider going forward.
Thanks, Sam. Derek, take us home, and then we'll ease into our recap.
Yeah, I just wanted to touch on the value of the state inventories real quick, because it, particularly for a smaller jurisdiction, if there's state inventory or federal inventory information out there that is suitable when doing this kind of analysis, I think it's very helpful, because we have limited resources. But I would caution that those state inventories are often developed for different purposes with different objectives, and you have to keep that in mind. And I'll use our geologic hazards overlay as a good case example. When we put our geologic hazards overlay together, we rely on information that the State Department of Geology and Mineral Industries put together for bluff erosion rates, particularly on the north side of town, and even for the dune erosion hazards. And their mapping takes it all the way into low risk. I mean, so they'll go from active hazard to high hazard to medium hazard to low risk. And from their perspective, all of those are hazards. And through our processes, we'd have folks from Dogami saying, yeah, you need to be cautious in all of these areas. Well, then you have the other side of that, which are property owners, particularly in the medium to low risk areas, which are saying, now we're dealing with hundreds of years before the bluff erosion will get here, and you're going to stigmatize my property by calling it a constraint and hazard. And so again, it gets back at that flexibility. Ultimately, what we chose to do was to constrain the active and high risk areas, but not the medium and low. And so we need to have that kind of flexibility to take that state product and work it through a local process that works for our policymakers and community.
Great. Perfect. Thank you, Derek. Karin, I think I'm going to hand it to you to maybe try to encapsulate what you heard today, and maybe revisit the equity framework, and then we can just briefly touch on, once again, our next two meetings before we adjourn.
Thank you. Yeah, I appreciate that. So, I heard a lot today around the cost of development. Anything can be built depending on how much you're willing to pay for it. And when we think about our buildable lands inventory, cities are depending on this land to meet a housing need over the 20-year planning period. So we really want to think about how we're depending on this land inventory to meet our needs in our community around housing. And when we look at some of these constraints, whether it's topography and ocean views on steep slopes, or waterfront property on a lake or a river, yes, there is housing that can be built, and for whom, and what's the needed housing, and where do we need it? Historically, where has housing been placed, and what type of housing, the characteristics of that housing, and really thinking about location of that housing. So as we continue on these conversations, next month, we'll talk a little bit, or we'll talk in depth about trying to estimate that capacity, some of the methodologies around redevelopment, partially vacant lands. We'll get into a little bit of being able to provide public facilities. And then in June, we'll really get into what is expected of, or what could be expected of, this development readiness piece under ONA. And so we're going to keep introducing that equity framework when you really think at a jurisdictional level that you depend on this land inventory to meet your housing need. What do you know about your community housing needs in your local area? We mentioned that we did not get any homework last time we met, but look for our project digest this time around. It'll probably go out in a couple weeks. And we're going to ask for more examples. So we have lists here of unique things that you're seeing in your inventories, things that we heard from Sam, that we heard from Coos County. It sounds like we have some other jurisdictions ready to do some BLIs, and really think, what's forefront in your minds? What are some challenges and concerns, some areas where you really appreciate the flexibility and how you're using that flexibility, but areas where we heard from several of you where you want more guidance and what that guidance looks like. So feel free to answer back on our request. Send us examples from your community. We'll look for more examples in different areas of the city, different sized communities, because what one community needs is a smaller jurisdiction may be very different than what a larger jurisdiction, say Medford or Bend, might need. And oh, there was one more thing I was supposed to share. Steve, I lost it. I'm going to need you to help me out with wrapping up. Oh, I know what it was, Steve. It
Yep.
wasn't me. You were supposed to share. We will meet once per month until June. And then what happens in July?
I know we're going to meet more frequently, twice a month, but I don't, is there more that you wanted us to say than that we're going to be meeting more like twice a month going forward, starting in July?
Yeah, just letting folks know, some of you are on the RAC and some of you are on the tax. So you'll see that the RAC will not meet in June. Those tax will not be meeting in June. There'll be some draft rule writing happening in June. But I think because Sarah mentioned at the top of the hour that we have a longer time frame. So, but we still need to pick up the cadence. So we want to do some initial draft rule writing probably around February. And just remind folks that we cannot meet during legislative session. So we as a committee will not meet January through March. We're only gonna take a portion, those 3 months of the legislative session. So we'll pick up the cadence in July, twice per month. And you will not see the RAC or the other two tax meet in June.
Thanks for covering for me,
Sorry
Kevin.
about that.
All right. Well, thanks again to everyone for the conversation today. I feel like we took another meaningful step forward in terms of hearing all of your perspectives. That's going to inform that draft rule writing that Karin mentioned. And we look forward to continuing this conversation in May. Thanks. Have a good afternoon, everyone.
Well done, Steve. Thank you.
Yeah, great job. All right.
Thanks.
Bye.
Okay, we'll see you shortly.